Soltou. Peraí. Ok.
Pode?
Uhum.
Boa noite a todos e a todas. Vou fazer a recepção do professor em inglês para que ele se sinta recepcionado, por nós. Good evening to all of you watching us live in quarantine. First of all, I would like to say it's a pleasure to be here introducing Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. Professor, we are deeply honored by your acceptance of Professor Frederico's invitation to speak to our students about the plague and the future of international politics. I know we will all have a wonderful experience with your lecture. I'm very proud to be the current head of International Relations undergraduate course here at the Centro Universitário de Brasília. It has long been a group of professors and students with deep commitment to high-quality education. Your presence with us today is certainly another proof of this culture of excellence of our International Relations course and our institute as a whole. I hope we keep in touch and we may count on your participation in other events promoted by our university. We also expected that after the pandemic, you can visit us in Brazil. I now give the floor to Professor Frederico Dias, who will introduce and mediate the lecture. Thank you again, Professor John. Please, Professor Frederico, you have the floor. After the pandemic, you can visit us in Brazil.
Good evening, dear students, colleague professors of the International Relations course of the Centro Universitário de Brasília, members of the wider academic community of our institution and general public. I would like to welcome you all to the last round of the debate series in Advanced Studies of World Politics, here today with no one else but Professor John Mearsheimer, the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of the University of Chicago. Let me thank Professor Dulce Furquim, our head of department, for the support. In fact, for the support of our whole institution, in the names of Professora Luciana Mussi, our technicians, Clayton and Marcelo here today, and also here today with us, our translator, Diego. Em português, para aqueles que não sabem, a gente está também tendo a tradução simultânea e basta acessar aí nas configurações do vídeo o botão para a segunda câmera que permite vocês assistirem a palestra já em tradução para o português. All right, I was talking about the translation to Portuguese, of course. Well, in the study of IR, international relations around the world, if there is one thing he does not need is an introduction, which I'm trying to deliver here. You may not agree with his theory, but Mearsheimer is certain a name in the reference of the most important pieces in the study of international relations in the post-Cold War era, standing as probably the greatest defender of realist theory. In this sense, he inherits from and advances the tradition of Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. His definitive contribution to IR theory, the book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001, is usually compared to classics like 1948's Politics Among Nations and 1979's Theory of International Politics. And his very new book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Ideals and International Realities, I believe, will also reserve another place for him by the side of another great IR classic. I talk about the 20 Years Crisis of Edward Howlett Carr. It seems that one of the main concerns that moved Carr in that book, Professor, the denunciation of the dangers stemming from the belief that a good idea could overcome power politics as being the guide to foreign policy, was the same concern you both had. Liberalism in international relations is still the most dangerous belief of all of the days, both of you and Edward Howlett Carr. Your book seems to be a call in that sense, an agnostic critique of the universalist thrust contained in such ideologies. I could say no more. It's a great honor to have the lecture of Professor Mearsheimer here in our institution today. The event goes as follows. Professor Mearsheimer will have the floor for the next 50 minutes. Then I will deliver some comments with the intent to create more opportunities for the development of his arguments. Next, we will have the question and answers section. There will be a group of students collecting the best questions from UniCEUB, and I will read them here to our distinguished guest. There is also I have to remember you of the Google form link for the certificate of your presence here today, watching and interacting with us. Even for those who are not students of our institution, you can check for your presence in this Google form. So, without further ado, for the benefit of us all, let's hear Professor John Mearsheimer words on the pandemic crisis of today and the future of international politics. Professor, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction to both of the professors, and thank you for the kind invitation to appear before the students and to give a lecture this evening. My only regret is that I'm here in Chicago and you're in Brazil, or somewhere in Brazil, I should say. Maybe even some of you are outside Brazil, and we don't have a chance to get together in one room and then socialize and talk afterwards. I do regret that. I've been to Brazil once before, indeed to Brasília, and I spoke to college students then, and I enjoyed it greatly. And I'm pleased to be here tonight. But again, it's too bad that I'm not there in person. But when the pandemic lifts, I shall return. The subject that I'm going to talk about tonight is the plague and the future of international politics. If I could have the slides, that would be very helpful.
Yeah,
as you can see the title here. Now, if I could have the next slide, which has some introductory comments that I would like to make. First of all, although I'm tasked to talk about international politics, what I want to focus on is great power politics, because I believe the great powers play the principal role in shaping international politics more generally. This is not to say that the great powers are morally superior to minor powers or to middle powers. It's simply to say that given the concentration of power that you find in the great powers, they play the key role in shaping the world that we live in. So I'm going to focus on great power politics this evening. Second, I also want to talk not just about the future of great power politics, but how great power politics will affect Brazil in the future. And then finally, I want to argue that the plague will have little effect on great power politics moving forward. I think the plague certainly has very important effects, but in terms of its effect on international relations, especially great power politics, I don't think it's very great. And I'll explain to you at the end of my talk why I think that's the case. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, this is the basic outline of my talk. First, I want to talk to you about the global balance of power from 1945 up to last year, up to the present, effectively. Then I want to talk about the global balance of power moving forward. In other words, what the global balance of power is going to look like in the next 3 decades. Then I want to talk about what I think the principal interests are of the great powers. For example, a country like the United States or the Soviet Union during the Cold War or the Chinese today, what are their principal interests? Then I want to talk about the emerging US-China competition. I think for all of you people who are watching me, who are much younger than I am, for the future that you're going to confront, I believe the US-China competition will be the defining element of international politics. You'll want to pay enormous attention to the US-China competition in the years ahead. Then I'm going to talk about what China's rise means for Brazil. And finally, I'll talk about the plague and great power politics. Could I have the next slide, please? Let's start by talking about the global balance of power since the end of World War II up to the present. Could I have the next slide, please? When you talk about the balance of power, here we're talking about the global balance of power, there are 2 key questions you want to ask yourself. You always want to ask, how many great powers are there in the system? Are there 2 great powers, in which case the system is bipolar? Are there 3 or more great powers in the system, in which case the system is multipolar? Or is there just 1 great power, in which case there is unipolarity? So that's the first question you should ask yourself. The second question you should ask yourself is, how powerful is each of those great powers? Are they all roughly equal? Or is there 1 great power, say, in a multipolar system that is much more powerful than the other great powers? So you want to talk about, again, the number of great powers, and then how power is distributed among them. If I could have the next slide. When I was young, like you students, the world that I lived in was a bipolar world. I was born in December 1947, and I lived most of my youth in the Cold War. And it was a bipolar world where there were 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that stood astride the globe. Then what happened in 1989 is that the Cold War ended. And in 1991, as you all know, December 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared. And we moved into a unipolar world. Virtually all of you were born into a unipolar world. Whereas I was born into a bipolar world, you were born into a unipolar world where there was 1 great power, which of course was the United States of America. This was the unipolar moment. Now, it's very important to understand that a fundamental change took place when we went from bipolarity to unipolarity. The glacis plates moved, and the world changed in fundamental ways. And what is happening today is that the world is changing. We're moving from unipolarity to multipolarity. We now have 3 great powers in the system. Many of you have observed the world around you and probably wondered, why is there all this activity? Why is there all this change? What's going on out there? What's happening in the world is we're moving from unipolarity to multipolarity. We are undergoing a sea change in the distribution of power. Because China has continued to rise over the 1990s and the early 2000s, China has now become a great power. Russia, which was knocked out of the balance of power in the 1990s, was in deep trouble in the 1990s, has come back from the dead under Vladimir Putin. So now we think of Russia as a great power, as well as China, and of course the United States, which had been the only great power in the unipolar moment, is still a great power. So what's happened here in the years since World War II ended is we've gone from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. Could I have the next slide, please? I think this is a really neat summary of what's happened. Okay, I'll take the next slide. Now, today, when you talk about the distribution of power inside that multipolar world that we live in, the United States is much more powerful than China, and China is much more powerful than Russia. Remember, I said to you a few minutes ago, you not only want to determine whether you live in a bipolar or a multipolar or a unipolar world, you also want to ask, how is the power distributed inside that world? And we are in emerging multipolarity. And today, again, you have a situation where the United States is much more powerful than China, which is much more powerful than Russia. The really interesting question, which we call the $64,000 question here in the United States, is what will the distribution of power look like in the multipolar world moving forward? In other words, what will be the distribution of power between the United States, China, and Russia? If I could have the next slide. And then the next slide. The two key building blocks of power are the size of a country's population and its wealth. Those are always the two questions you want to ask yourself. How many people does a country have, and how much wealth does it have? In the bipolar world of the Cold War, we did not consider China to be a great power. China had a huge population, but it was not very wealthy. What's happened in recent decades is that China still has a huge population, but it's become very wealthy. A country like Switzerland is very wealthy, but it does not have a large population. So there's no way Switzerland can be a great power. The reason that the United States is a great power and has been a great power for a long time is that it has a large population, it's a huge population, and it's an incredibly rich country. What's happened with China today is it still has a very large population and it's become increasingly wealthy. So you always want to remember that the two key building blocks of power are population size and wealth. Now, let's talk a little bit about the United States. The United States has roughly 329 million people, and its population is projected to be, in the year 2050, that's roughly 30 years from now, 379 million people. As you all know, the United States is an immigrant culture, and because it's an immigrant culture, it's almost guaranteed that the United States will continue to grow in size population-wise. Furthermore, the United States has a dynamic and powerful economy. It occasionally runs into trouble for sure, but there is a tremendous amount of dynamism in the American economy. And there's every reason to think that not only will its population grow in the future, but in terms of wealth, it will continue to grow it as well. So the United States is going to be a major player moving forward. This brings us to Russia. Russia is a declining great power. Of the three great powers that exist today, it is the weakest. Remember what I said to you in the beginning. when I started talking about the distribution of power in the multipolar world that we now live in. The United States is more powerful than China, and China is more powerful than Russia. Russia does not have a bright future. It has significant demographic problems. It's shrinking in size population-wise. It has significant economic problems. The idea that Russia is a threat to dominate Asia or Europe is not a serious argument. There is not going to be a greater Russia. If I could have the next slide, please. This slide highlights the population figures and the prospects for growing more wealthy for Russia. Russia now has 146 million people, and it's predicted to have in the year 2050 approximately 136 million people. So its population size is going to shrink by 10 million, and it's going to become an older population. And that is going to cause problems. With regard to the Russian economy, virtually everybody agrees that it's much too heavily dependent on gas and oil. And there's little evidence that it has been able to modernize its productive capacity in a major way. And for Russia to be a really powerful state in the system, it has to modernize its economy. It has to become much less dependent on gas and oil exports for its wealth. But it's been unable to do that. That brings us to China. The real threat to challenge the United States is China. In fact, if China were to continue to grow in a really impressive way over the next 40 or 50 years, it might even overtake the United States and become more powerful. The next slide, please. Start with population. As I said to you before, the United States has roughly 329 million people today, and it will have 379 million in 2050. China has 1.4 billion people. That means that China today has 4 times as many people as the United States. Now, the Chinese population is expected to remain constant. I'm sure you all understand that this is a result of the one-child policy. So China's population is not going to grow in size, but it's still going to be well over 3 times the size of America's population in 2050. I think the number is 3.7, right? So in terms of population size, China is growing. China is not growing, but it's still going to be much bigger than the United States. Now, here's some figures that help you get a handle on Chinese wealth. If China today had Hong Kong's per capita gross national income, it would have a gross national income of $70.4 trillion. This is to say, if China was a giant Hong Kong, its GNI would be $70.4 trillion, compared with the US GNI of $20.7 trillion. That means if China turned into a giant Hong Kong, it would be 3.5 times wealthier than the United States. And then I showed down below that if China had South Korea's per capita GNI, it would have about twice the wealth of the United States. So what I'm saying with this slide is if this country that now has 4 times the population of the United States turns into a giant Hong Kong because it continues to grow economically, or turns into South Korea, it is going to be much wealthier than the United States, in addition to having many more people than the United States. And as I told you early on, population size and wealth are of enormous importance in determining the global balance of power. If I could have the next slide. To give you a feel for what China's potential looks like, what I want to do is I want to talk about the United States versus the Soviet Union in the Cold War and then compare it to China. This is really quite amazing if you think about it. The United States and the Soviet Union had roughly the same size population in the Cold War, roughly the same size population. And at the very most, this is being generous to the Soviets, at the most, they had 1/3 the wealth of the United States. I just posited a situation in 2050 where China is going to have 3.7 times as many people as the United States. And if it continues to grow in an impressive way, if its economy continues to grow in an impressive way, it will have about 2 times as much wealth as the United States. This is to say, the United States is going to be facing a very formidable China in the decades ahead if it continues to grow economically. Now, let me switch gears and talk about the principal interests of great powers. Really, what we're talking about when we talk about the interests of great powers, more than anything else, is what regions of the world matter to a great power. First and foremost, of course, is its own neighborhood. Any great power is going to care more than anything else about the balance of power in its own region. Then it's going to be very worried about the other regions of the world where the other great powers are located. And then finally, it's going to pay careful attention to regions that have critical resources like oil. If I could have the next slide. This is a slide that builds on the previous slide that raises the question of which regions of the world matter the most to the United States. Obviously, the Western Hemisphere is of primary importance. All Brazilians understand that the United States cares greatly about the Western Hemisphere, just like Brazil cares more than anything else about the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because it's our neighborhood, it's our backyard. It's of primary importance. The other 2 areas that the United States cares greatly about are Europe and Northeast Asia, historically. Why is that the case? Because that's where the other great powers are. In Europe, that's where Imperial Germany was. That's where Nazi Germany was. That's where the Soviet Union was. And Northeast Asia is where Japan was, or Japan is. It's where the Soviet Union is. Right? So we cared greatly about Northeast Asia, and we cared greatly about Europe. Why? Because that's where other great powers are. And then the other area outside of the United States that the United States paid special attention to was the Persian Gulf. And why was that the case? Very simple. That's where the oil is. And oil is an exceptionally important resource. And Uncle Sam cares greatly about who controls the oil in the Persian Gulf. So when you think about, if I could just go back to that previous slide, if you think about the areas of the world that have historically mattered to the United States, it's the Western Hemisphere first, our backyard, then those 2 areas with great powers, and then the Gulf because of oil. So that's the bottom line there. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, what are the principal goals of great powers? A great power in an ideal world has 2 goals. One is to achieve regional hegemony, and the other is to prevent other great powers from dominating their region of the world. In other words, the name of the game is to prevent the rise of a peer competitor, another regional hegemon. So in an ideal world, what you want to do is you want to dominate your region and make sure nobody else dominates its region. If I could have the next slide, please. This describes what the United States has done over the course of its history. The United States was created in 1783. That's when we got our independence from Britain, in 1783. And the United States went to enormous lengths to establish regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The United States conquered or acquired huge amounts of territory in North America. And then it adopted the Monroe Doctrine, which meant that it pushed the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere. And it told the European great powers, we, the United States, own the Western Hemisphere, and you are not welcome in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about, as almost all Brazilians know very well. Right? The United States, by 1900, had established regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And as I told you, that's the first goal of a great power. The second goal of a great power is to make sure that you don't have a peer competitor, to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. Well, in the 20th century, after the United States became a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, it faced 4 countries that threatened to become regional hegemons either in Europe or Asia. And those 4 potential hegemons were Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. All of this is to say, the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. The United States is a ruthless great power. And if it sees another country trying to imitate it, to become a regional hegemon in its area of the world, it will go to great lengths to prevent that from happening. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, having talked a little bit about the history of American strategy, what I want to do is talk about the emerging US-China competition. If I could have the next slide. The question you want to ask yourself is, what is going to be a rising China's grand strategy? Well, I told you what great powers try to do. China will attempt to become a regional hegemon in Asia. As I often say to my Chinese friends, if I were in Beijing, I'd want to become a regional hegemon. The United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. Virtually all Americans are perfectly happy with that situation. So if Americans like regional hegemony, why should we be surprised if China attempts to become a regional hegemon? Don't you think China wants to be by far the most powerful state in Asia? The Chinese remember very well what happened when they were weak. It's called the Century of National Humiliation. It runs from the late 1840s up until the late 1940s. That's the Century of National Humiliation. The Chinese were weak, and when they were weak, other countries took advantage of them. They have no intention of letting that ever happen again. They want to be really powerful. They want to be a regional hegemon. So my argument is they're going to attempt to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. In essence, they're going to aim not only to be the most powerful country in Asia, but they're going to aim to push the United States military out of Asia. The Chinese will tell you behind closed doors that we're going to try and push the Americans first beyond the first island chain, then beyond the second island chain. What the Chinese are saying is, we're going to have a Monroe Doctrine of our own. You know, the United States has a Monroe Doctrine, as I said before, and as, of course, virtually all Brazilians know. We have a Monroe Doctrine. Well, don't you think the Chinese are going to want to have their own Monroe Doctrine? Do you think the Chinese are going to be happy about the United States military driving aircraft and ships up and down China's coast? Do you think the Chinese are happy about the fact that the American military has ground forces stationed in South Korea and in Japan and in other places in East Asia? I can assure you the Chinese are not happy about that. And if I were Chinese, if I were a Chinese leader, I would not be happy. I'd want the Americans out. In the same way, I don't want the Chinese coming into the Western Hemisphere. In the same way, I didn't want the Soviets coming into the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. So you see that what China is going to try and do is imitate the United States. Can I have the next slide, please? This, of course, raises the question, what is the Americans, or what are the Americans going to do in response? What's the United States going to do as China tries to dominate Asia? As I told you, the United States will go to great lengths to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon. The historical record is very clear here. Just think, Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. We went to great lengths not to let them dominate Europe or Asia. We will go to great lengths to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon. To put it in slightly different words, we will go to great lengths to prevent China from becoming a peer competitor. That's why, as I said to you early on, you are going to have an intense security competition between China and the United States. And that is going to be the dominating geopolitical feature of the 21st century. Can I have the next slide, please? I want to talk a little bit about what China's rise means for Brazil. As China rises, it will have powerful incentives to form military alliances with countries in the Western Hemisphere and to actually deploy military forces in the Western Hemisphere. Now you ask yourself, why is that the case? Well, first of all, the United States and China will be rivals. They will be bitter rivals, right, in the world that we're moving into. And the Chinese will be looking for allies. And they will especially be interested in allies in the Western Hemisphere. Because if the Chinese can cause the United States trouble in the Western Hemisphere, then the United States has to concentrate on its security in its own backyard, and it has much less freedom to intervene in East Asia, which of course is China's backyard. So the Chinese would much prefer to pin the United States down, to cause the United States trouble in its own backyard, in America's backyard, rather than have the Americans freely operating in East Asia. Now, some of you may think this is hard to imagine, but remember, the Soviet Union tried to do this during the Cold War, tried to do it with Cuba. It put missiles in Cuba in 1962. Later on, it talked about building a naval base. The Soviets talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. So the Soviet Union tried to have a military alliance and move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the United States bitterly opposed the Soviets in both of those instances. And then, just to drive my point home, the United States does it in East Asia. The United States has military forces in China's backyard. So if we have military forces in China's backyard, why would you not expect a powerful China to move military forces into our backyard? As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if the United States does it, don't be surprised if the Chinese do it. So what I'm telling you here is you should understand that China has powerful incentives to form military alliances in the Western Hemisphere and even to deploy military forces here in the Western Hemisphere. Could I have the next slide, please? Furthermore, there are always going to be countries in the Western Hemisphere that fear the United States for good reason. Before, I made the point that the United States is a ruthless great power. I have no illusions about the United States' behavior. Most Americans, as you know, think that the United States is an exceptionally benign country and everybody should love the United States. That's not my view of how great powers operate, the United States included. So I understand full well that there are countries in the Western Hemisphere that fear the United States for good reason, and they would like to form an alliance with a great power. Think Chile and Cuba during the Cold War. The United States had its gun sights on Cuba from 1959 until the end of the Cold War. In fact, the United States still has its gun sights on Cuba. Cuba needs allies. Chile needed allies during the Cold War. Today, Venezuela, Cuba, the United States views Cuba and Venezuela as mortal enemies. The United States has its gun sights on Cuba and Venezuela. Don't you think those countries would like to form an alliance with China, if that's possible? I'd be hardly surprised. And then there's the possibility that Brazil might someday look to form a military alliance with China. People might say, that's impossible. Hard to imagine that happening. I wouldn't bet on that. I think one could tell stories where there are circumstances where Brazil has a deep-seated interest in forming an alliance with China because of fear of the United States. The balance of power today does not favor doing that. There's no question about it. But if you hypothesize a situation, if you imagine a situation where China becomes much more powerful and it has greater freedom to roam into the Western Hemisphere, to move into the Western Hemisphere, and Brazil has a serious conflict with the United States, I could imagine Brazil and China forming an alliance. Could I have the next slide, please? Finally, in keeping with the Monroe Doctrine, it's important to understand that the United States will go to great lengths. It'll go to enormous lengths to prevent any country in the Western Hemisphere from forming a military alliance with China, and certainly allowing Chinese military assets in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine matters greatly to the United States. Senator John Kerry said a few years ago that the Monroe Doctrine really didn't matter anymore. You don't want to pay any attention to what he said. That was foolish. The United States cares greatly about the Monroe Doctrine. And as I say, it will go to great lengths to prevent any country, Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, from forming a military alliance with China. But I do want to point out that Chinese economic penetration into the Western Hemisphere will be tolerated. It's possible for countries like Brazil to have very close economic relations with China and not cause problems with the United States. It's military penetration, Chinese military penetration into the Western Hemisphere that is a source of potential problem. Okay, the last subject I want to talk about before we go to a discussion is the plague and great power politics. My first point to you is that there's little evidence at this point that the plague is going to alter the global balance of power in the decades ahead. As you know from having listened to me talk now for almost an hour, I place great emphasis on the global balance of power and I place great emphasis on the balance of power among the gorillas in the system. By gorillas, I mean the great powers. When you look at the distribution of power among the gorillas in the system, I don't see any evidence that the plague is going to make, for example, China grow faster than the United States or make the United States grow faster than China. I think that over time, the plague will have little effect on the global balance of power. Second, I think there's hardly any evidence that the plague is eroding sovereignty and that the modern nation state is beginning to lose its essence, its meaning. It's becoming weaker and weaker as a result of this plague. There's some people who argue that as a result of the plague, we're going to need much greater international cooperation, and states are not going to be able to act alone if they hope to defeat the plague. I think there's no question that as a result of the plague, there's going to be continued cooperation. But I think, if anything, states are going to act in a more self-interested way to defeat the plague rather than in a more cooperative way. So I see no evidence that the sovereign modern nation state is under threat because of the plague. As I say in my last comment, if you look carefully, what you see is that states worry first and foremost about their own welfare when they face an extreme emergency. And of course, the plague is an extreme emergency. Could I have the next slide, please? So my bottom line is that the plague certainly matters for the health of millions of people around the world. And it certainly will hurt the global economy in profound ways. I don't want to underplay or underestimate the damage that's going to be caused by the plague. The damage is going to be great. But my bottom line is that there's little reason to think that it will have a major impact on great power politics, especially the growing Cold War between China and the United States. I think that if China continues to grow economically in an impressive way in the decades ahead, that the US-China competition will be the defining feature of the international system. And that will have profound effects for every state on the planet, including Brazil. Thank you very much. I'd be perfectly happy to take questions from the professor and from the audience and engage everybody on this fascinating subject.
Thank you again, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Professor John. Maybe I'll have two questions here. I was intending to have two questions you did not deliver so focused on your talk, but one of them, which I was definitely interested, you just mentioned and developed on the role Brazil can have in this future geopolitical competition between the United States and China. But I mean, I would like to know one thing in more theoretical terms. You define this competition in international relations in very geographical terms. I mean, you care about regions, which other realists didn't make for what didn't make any difference for other realists, these geographical questions. But so you just said right now in your lecture here today too, that a major goal of a power is to protect its own region. And then the Western Hemisphere is considered to be a region. I will ask you if you don't consider this to be a very historical, political construction, the notion of a region, putting together both different land masses of North and Central America and South America, because they are not a region in such physical, geographical terms, but how does it become a single region that is the backyard of the United States? I mean, I would like to know about I think that many, as you say, many Americans, but also it's very common here in Brazil, students of international relations don't like realism. They think that it's not a theory that would help them to construct a more effective foreign policy, for example, because it does not have much to say about peripheral countries. So I will ask you about that. What space is there for Brazil in a realist perspective, other than being just in the backyard of the United States? I mean, realism cannot be a serious guide for our foreign policy in terms of reaching our own objectives, our own goals, and modest goals, I say, like development, the end of absolute poverty here in Brazil, for example, not such great goals like being a power in the region, but just to develop in the sense of social economic terms. What realism could say to us about that, Professor?
Good. Those are two excellent sets of questions. Let me first focus on your point about regions. I think that you're correct that I am the first realist to privilege regions, the first realist to argue that regions really matter, and that when you want to assess the interests of a great power, you should ask the question, what regions of the world does that great power care about? So I think that's true. It's important to emphasize that there's no simple definition of what a region is. And I think that you can do a pretty neat job of dividing the world up into regions, such as the Middle East, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, the Persian Gulf, and so forth and so on. I would admit, however, that sometimes it's tricky to divide up an area. So it's not always easy, but I think it is a useful tool for understanding international politics. Now, your particular question had to do with my categorization of the entire Western Hemisphere as one region. And you said to me, why, John, do you consider North America, Central America, and South America all to be part of one region? Now, I think you could argue it's three different regions. You could argue that, and I wouldn't say you are wrong, because it's just your definition, and definitions are neither right nor wrong. The key question one wants to ask for assessing the value of a definition is how useful it is, not whether it's right or wrong, because there's no right or wrong definition. I believe that it's useful to think of the Western Hemisphere as one region because the United States thinks of it as one region. And I'm interested in great power politics, and I'm interested in explaining how the world works. If an asteroid hit the planet, and all of the regions of the world disappeared except the Western Hemisphere. And all of a sudden, Brazil became as powerful as the United States. Then it would make sense in that circumstance to talk about South America as one region, North America as one region, and Central America as another region, a buffer state or a buffer region in between. Because then the balance of power on the planet would be very different than it is today. So I can see circumstances where you would want to divide the Western Hemisphere into 3 regions or 2 regions. But I think given what the world looks like today in terms of the distribution of power, it's useful to distinguish the Western Hemisphere or to describe the Western Hemisphere as a single region. But that's not to say that that's the right definition. It's to say that I think it's the most useful definition now. With regard to your second question, it's a fascinating question about what use is realism for Brazil. Brazil is obviously not a great power, and it's not deeply involved in great power politics. So therefore, one would expect that realism is not a subject that, or a theory that people in Brazil pay a lot of attention to. Let me make 2 points about that. First of all, I think it's very important for Brazilians, especially people who do foreign policy, to understand basic realist logic, because it's very important to help Brazilians understand the United States and China. Even if Brazil does not act like a realist great power, Brazil wants to know what the United States and what China are up to. It wants to understand the nature of the competition between those 2 countries, because it's going to have profound consequences for Brazil. So I think it's important to understand realism for that reason. Second point I'd make is that one of the great puzzles in international relations is why there has been peace in South America for so long. What's really remarkable about South America is what a peaceful continent it is. And I think it's the fact that that South America is such a peaceful continent that explains in part why there's so little interest in realism. Nevertheless, I think that states, and this certainly includes Brazil, should always think about their survival and potential threats to their survival. And they should pay very serious attention to other states in their neighborhood and what they might do to them. So I think that, in a very subtle and sophisticated way, it's in Brazil's interest to think about the balance of power in South America, to think about policies that it might pursue to enhance its prospects for survival, and to constantly be asking the question, why is South America so peaceful, and will it remain peaceful forever and ever? So that would be my argument as to why Brazilians should take realism seriously, even though I do understand, in keeping with the thrust of your question, that realism as a theory is not going to be on the front burner in Brazil today. I think you're muted. You're...
Sorry, Professor. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you very much for the questions. Now we have questions from students here watching us, almost 500 students, I think now.
Wow.
And it's very interesting. Students from all over Brazil and also from New York, the New York University here. So I'll give you sets of 2 questions, right? The first one is from Bruna Lima of the PUC Minas University here in Brazil. What are the main disparities in U.S. action in Syria between the Obama and Trump governments? How much did policymakers act differently in each case? And the second from Aline Schneider from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. She asks that even after the presentation of Mueller's report to the American Congress, much is speculated about Russia's interference in decision-making process in the elections, in the 2018 elections. What's your perspective on Russian interference in American foreign policy and how to protect the USA in the next elections from that kind of interference?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm honored that 500 students have turned out to listen to me talk, and that some of those students were even from outside Brazil. I appreciate that very much. Okay, first question had to do with U.S. policy towards Syria. And the questioner asked me to contrast Trump's approach with Obama's approach. I think that President Obama was deeply committed to staying in Syria. And at first, he was deeply committed to overthrowing the Assad regime. Very important to understand that. When the trouble broke out in Syria in 2011, trouble in Syria broke out in 2011, the Obama administration went to work to help overthrow Assad. They, of course, failed because the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah came in to the fight, and they have helped keep Assad in power. But the United States, nevertheless, remained in Syria. Now, when Donald Trump got elected, Donald Trump made it clear he wanted to get out of Syria. Donald Trump made it clear he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. Donald Trump has made it clear he didn't at least like to reduce troops in Europe, if not get out. Donald Trump has not started any more wars, unlike his predecessor. So the question is, given that President Trump was interested in getting out of Syria, unlike President Obama, has he been successful? And the answer is no. We're still in Syria. We're still in Afghanistan. And this is because of the power of the foreign policy establishment in the United States, what is sometimes referred to as the blob. The blob is interested in keeping the United States involved in the forever wars. It doesn't want these forever wars to end. So Donald Trump has been unable to get us out of Syria. And the end result is that even though he had different goals than President Obama when it comes to Syria, he ended up in the same place. Second question had to do with Russian interference in the 2016 election. And the extreme version of this is that the Trump administration colluded or cooperated with the Russians so that they could defeat Hillary Clinton in November 2016. The argument that many people make is that if the Russians had not intervened on Trump's behalf, or to put it in even stronger terms, if the Trump administration had not worked with the Russians, Hillary Clinton would be in the White House. I don't believe that. I'm actually one of a small number of Americans who don't believe that. I think that there's no evidence of significant Russian interference in the election. I think there is certainly no evidence that the Trump administration or the Trump presidential campaign, I should say, cooperated with the Russians to defeat Hillary Clinton. I think that Donald Trump won the election fair and square. I'm not a Trump supporter. Indeed, I voted for Hillary Clinton. But the fact is, Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate and she lost. And Donald Trump won. And he didn't win because of the Russians. He won because a lot of Americans wanted him in the White House, and a lot of Americans did not want Hillary Clinton in the White House. I think that, to be honest, when the Democrats lost, they had to come up with an excuse for what happened. And the excuse was to blame the Russians. The Democrats were not going to blame themselves. Hillary Clinton was not going to say, I lost because I was a terrible candidate. She's going to say, I was a wonderful candidate. I lost because the other side cheated. They worked with the Russians to throw the election. But I'm sorry, I've seen no evidence to support that line of argument. And I think Donald Trump won fair and square, even though I think the outcome has been disastrous for the United States.
So you would say there is nothing like a Russian lobby in the United States as there is a Israel lobby as your book explores.
There is no Russian lobby in the United States. You can rest assured of that. I would just say to you, Frederico, that in my personal view, I believe the United States should be closely allied with Russia because the United States needs Russia to help contain China. My talk was all about America coming up with a containment policy against China. I think it's remarkably foolish for us to have bad relations with Russia and to push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. But that is in effect what we have done. And President Trump, to his credit, wanted to improve relations with the Russians. I think on this issue, his instincts were correct. But the problem is that if anything, his election meant that relations with the Russians have gotten much worse because, again, the Democrats have blamed the Russians for Trump's victory, and they have made the argument that they'll interfere even in the 2020 election. And therefore, we should have hostile relations with the Russians. But I don't believe this is in our strategic interest.
Wow, perfect, Professor. So the next two questions. The first is from Aurora Rader from the NYU. How can civilian mobilizations, movements for justice and freedom influence changes in the police and judicial system or impact policymakers? A take of yourself from these civil in the United States. And the next one, Mayara Beres from the Universidade Federal Fluminense. How accurate is the concept of multipolarity to express the multipolarity of the world combined with the U.S. greater expression of military power?
Well, could you repeat, Frederico, the first question? It had to do with the protests.
Yes. How can civilian mobilizations, movements for justice and freedom influence changes in the police and judicial system in the United States? It's like a very domestic question. I don't think it's related to foreign policy. But
yeah, with regard to the first question on, what the protest movement will lead to in terms of changes regarding the police and regarding the judicial system, it's very hard to say at this point in time. I think there will be some significant changes in the political system, in the policing system, and hopefully they'll be all for the good. I don't see any changes in the judicial system coming out of this. I actually believe the most important issue at this point in America's history has to do with economic inequality. There is tremendous economic inequality in the United States. And when you marry that economic inequality with the devastating effects of the coronavirus, we have a situation in the United States where huge numbers of people in the lower classes and in the middle classes are in desperate economic straits. And I think the really important issue moving forward is whether or not the United States can formulate policies that create jobs, well-paying jobs for people in the working classes and in the working class and in the middle class. The question is, can the United States rescue its economy, get its economy back on its feet, and do something to greatly reduce the economic inequality that we have? I think, to be honest, a lot of young people in the United States have lost faith in the American dream. They don't believe that even if they work hard, they can become really successful. And I think this does not bode well for America. So I think this is, for me, the most important issue. Police reform, we definitely need it. Judicial reform, we need it. But I think the most important thing we need at this point in time is to fix the economy in a major way. With regard to the second question about multipolarity, I actually don't like that concept because uni means one and multi means more than one. And you either have one pole or you have multiple poles. And everybody understands, I hope, that a pole is a great power. When we talk about multipolarity, the poles are great powers. You either have one great power, unipolarity, or multipolarity, three or more great powers, or bipolarity. However, I would say, I think there is a simple term that I use which captures what the questioner was getting at. And that's the phrase unbalanced multipolarity. In other words, remember what I said in my talk. You want to count the number of poles, and then you want to ask yourself, what is the distribution of power inside the particular polarity that you have? And what I think the questioner is seeing when she talks about, or he talks about, multipolarity is a multipolar system with one very powerful country. And I would call that unbalanced unbalanced multipolarity. I think it's a better term, and I would reserve unipolarity for a system where there's only one great power.
And then you say, that the unbalanced multipolarity is the most dangerous system for the occasion of wars.
Yes. My argument is that World War I and World War II, both in World War II in Europe and World War II in East Asia, was caused by unbalanced multipolarity. It was Imperial Germany in Europe before World War I, Nazi Germany in Europe before World War II, and then Imperial Japan in Asia before World War II. In those regions, and as you, Frederico, said before, I like to focus on regions. In those regions, Europe and Northeast Asia, you had unbalanced multipolarity. You had a number of great powers, but you had one great power that was especially strong. Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. And when that happens, you invariably get big trouble because that especially powerful great power tries to dominate the region.
Perfect. We have another question of Júlio César Mota, filho da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, acredito, I believe. What will be the political consequences for the global South in a multipolar world? What are there interesting differences from what happened in the era of bipolarity? I would like to ask to that question what are the prospects for ending extreme poverty in the world in this multipolar system we are going to experience at least to the half of the century? And then we have the question of Ian Rebouças, of the Universidade Estácio, Recife. What are the chances for cooperation between Russia and China since they share borders? Any risk of conflict between them in this geopolitical competition?
Yeah. Okay. There are three questions there, one of which is your question. I'll start with that, about the prospects for ending extreme poverty. I think there's little hope in the foreseeable future of ending extreme poverty. And I really fear that as a result of the pandemic, the extreme poverty is going to get worse. This has nothing to do with great power politics. It has nothing to do with the US-China competition. I just think when you read the newspapers every day about what's going on with the global economy and what the effects will likely be on poorer countries around the world, it looks like the situation is only going to get worse. Let's hope my prediction is dead wrong, but I don't think it will be wrong. I think we're in for very tough times ahead. And again, I want to emphasize that I think we're in for very tough times inside the richer countries as well. I think the pandemic is having devastating economic consequences that will play out inside the rich countries and be even worse inside the poorer countries. And this is a tragedy of the first order. The question on Russia and China, that's a great question. The Russians will tell you that they do not understand why the Americans are picking a fight with them and pushing Russia into the arms of the Chinese, because the Russians have a certain fear of the Chinese, and they should be natural allies of the United States. You want to remember that in 1969, the Soviet Union and China fought militarily along the Ussuri River out in the Siberian region of the Soviet Union. They actually fought, and large numbers of people died. The Chinese and the Soviets did not like each other at all. And today, with the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese influence in Central Asia is growing significantly. And this bothers the Russians greatly. The Russians are very nervous about Chinese influence on their border. So again, one would think the Americans and the Russians would be allies, and that the Russians, much like the Americans, would be suspicious of the Chinese. Because as the questioner said, when you look at the border between Russia and China, there's reason for them, those two countries, to fear each other. But of course, because of America's foolish policies, because America has been so hostile to Russia, we have effectively driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which makes no sense. Then the final question, which was actually the first question, had to do with what the political consequences for the South, for the global South would be as we move into a multipolar world and away from a unipolar world. I would go back to my presentation and I would say that the US-China competition will spill over into the global South, and it will give countries in the global South incentives to exploit that competition. In some cases, countries will benefit from that competition, and in other cases, countries will be hurt. But it'll be a very different situation than existed during the unipolar world. In the unipolar world, the United States was incredibly powerful, and the United States became a crusader state. So it was the United States that was intervening all over the world. Think about the Bush Doctrine and what the United States did in the greater Middle East. The United States was so powerful, and it had no great power rivals. So it was free to intervene in the global South. As I said before, the glacis plates are moving. We're moving out of unipolarity into multipolarity. And the defining feature of that multipolarity is the US-China competition. And that competition will spill over into the global South, just as the US-Soviet competition spilled over into the global South during the Cold War. And it'll be a very different world than was the case in the unipolar moment. I think you're on mute.
Professor, sorry, again.
Yes, no problem.
I will insist to listen to you on this topic about great power politics and poverty, extreme poverty. Extreme poverty has nothing to do with great power politics. So in the sense that if we study international relations, the place to study poverty is not in our field. What would you say about that? And there's a student asking here, Eduardo dos Santos from our Centro Universitário de Brasília. He asks if the next president, if Trump loses the election, the next president being Biden, he will return with the liberal hegemony initiative in foreign policy.
Okay. Your question was with regard to extreme poverty. And you and I both agree it's a very important question, an enormously important question. And you said, I think quite correctly, if you want to study extreme poverty and figure out how to deal with the problem, don't study international relations as we study international relations. And I think that's correct. We do not have much to say about extreme poverty. But that's not because we're irresponsible. It's because we deal with another subject. The example I would give to illustrate this is if you need surgery on your lungs, you don't go see a brain doctor. You see a surgeon who specializes in operating on lungs. In the medical profession, there are all sorts of specialists, people who work on the brain and people who work on the lungs. In the world that we operate in, there are all sorts of subfields, areas of expertise. And I have virtually no expertise about international poverty. I have virtually no expertise about global warming. And it's not because I think global warming is unimportant or because I think extreme poverty is unimportant. It's just that that's not the subject that I focus on. I focus mainly on questions about war and peace, nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons, and so forth and so on. So I have a different area of expertise. But anybody who's interested in extreme poverty, he or she would be foolish to come to Chicago and get a PhD with me because I'm not the person. You would want to go to another program and work with someone else. Second question had to do with what would happen if Joe Biden wins the presidency and moves into the White House. What would happen with his foreign policy? What would it look like? Wouldn't it be liberal hegemony, which is the foreign policy that the Democrats and the Republicans pursued during the unipolar moment? My argument is, and I lay this out in great detail in my book, The Great Delusion, my argument is that it's only in a unipolar world that a country like the United States can pursue liberal hegemony. It's only in a unipolar world where the single great power has no great power rivals that it can pursue a highly ideological foreign policy, right? Because it doesn't have to worry about the balance of power. You don't have to worry about realpolitik. You can pursue liberal hegemony. But as I emphasized in my talk, and as I've emphasized in the Q&A period, we have moved from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And that means great power politics or realism is back on the table. And there is no way that Joe Biden can pursue liberal hegemony, even though I'm sure he would love to pursue liberal hegemony. Joseph Biden was a big supporter of the forever wars. He was a big supporter of liberal hegemony. He helped get the United States into a whole heck of a lot of trouble on the foreign policy front. He helped get Donald Trump elected. So I think that deep down, he'd love to go back to liberal hegemony. But I'm sorry, he can't do that because we're no longer in unipolarity. We live in a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, great power politics or realpolitik dominates.
What are the prospects of these restraint from liberal hegemony in case of a Biden victory? The prospects for Condoleezza Rice being his vice candidate, because it would be a sign of a threat to liberal hegemony, no? Because she was the secretary of George Bush, right?
No, the person that they're talking about is Susan Rice, not Condoleezza Rice.
All right.
So Susan Rice was Barack Obama's national security advisor. And Condoleezza Rice, as you say, was George W. Bush's Secretary of State. But if Biden let me put it differently. There are some people who think that Biden will choose Susan Rice, even though she has no political experience, as his running mate. And I think, apropos your comment, that Susan Rice has that liberal hegemonist impulse hardwired into her. I mean, Susan Rice, just like Joe Biden, wants to run the world. And they like using military force here, there, and everywhere. But again, my argument is they cannot pursue liberal hegemony. No matter what they want to do, they have no choice but to contain China.
Yeah, it's strange. Sounds strange because Condoleezza Rice is a Republican. But I checked here, Professor, there are many articles talking about the prospects for her placing as vice president. But
Condoleezza Rice?
Condoleezza Rice.
Really?
How strange. But there are some texts here arguing about Susan Rice. But very strange, right? She was a supporter of the liberal hegemony project, of course,
yes.
Right?
Yes. It's very important to understand that liberal hegemony was staunchly supported by both Republicans and Democrats. The foreign policy establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike, supported liberal hegemony. And again, it was Donald Trump who ran against liberal hegemony in the 2016 campaign. And you want to remember that Donald Trump defeated all of the Republicans in the Republican primary, people like Jeb Bush, right? And then he defeated Hillary Clinton in the general election in November of 2016. And both the Republican candidates, besides Trump, all defended liberal hegemony. And Hillary, of course, defended liberal hegemony. It was Trump who ran against it, and Bernie Sanders for that matter. And Bernie Sanders did very well because the American public is tired of being a crusader state. The American people want to end the forever wars. Trump understood this intuitively, and it helped get him elected. But the blob, people like Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, they've never seen a war they didn't want to fight.
Well, very interesting. So I have a question. I think the last two questions, I may say, but one of them is closely related to this topic. What can you see some similar? It's from Carlos of our Centro Universitário de Brasília. Can you see some similarities between Jair Bolsonaro, our president, and Donald Trump in their foreign policies? And the other question, what are the damage of extremist leaders like ours in the strategy of a great power? The other question, they are, so these two questions, in fact, they are linked. So the last question is, what is the role Brazil and India should have, considering they could be considered what George Kennan has called monster countries, countries with a large population and many natural resources? This is from Marco Túlio of our own Centro Universitário too. Professor.
So the second question is about a country that has lots of people and lots of resources?
Yes, monster countries, as George Kennan has probably. He indicates a quotation from George Kennan, monster countries.
Monster?
Yeah.
I've never heard that phrase. Okay. Well, let me take the questions in reverse order. I think any country that has lots of people and lots of resources should go to great lengths to develop its economy and become very wealthy and become a great power. If I were a country like India or I were a country like Brazil, I would be very concerned about modernizing my economy as much as possible and becoming very wealthy. I would also be very interested in having lots of babies and making the population grow in size. As I said to you before, the two key indicators of military power, or of power more generally, are population size and wealth. And if you have resources and you have lots of people and you don't have wealth, what you want to do is go to great lengths to develop wealth, to become rich, and to become a great power. I think if I'm India or I'm Brazil, I want to be as wealthy and as powerful as I possibly can be. And by the way, just to talk a little bit about India, as you know, the Indians and the Chinese have been fighting with each other on the border between those two countries up in the Himalayan mountains. They've been fighting over what's called the line of control. India is in a very difficult situation because China is growing increasingly richer. It's growing more powerful economically than India. And this is going to have all sorts of military consequences down the road, which is not good news given that India and China have these differences over the line of control, and you may have a military conflict. So it's in India's interest to grow more powerful economically and therefore more powerful militarily. So that's my basic view on that issue. With regard to the foreign policies of Brazil and the United States, this gets back to your question about realism, Frederico. The fact is that Brazil operates in a different world than the United States. And the United States is a great power. It's the most powerful state in the world. And it's militarily involved almost everywhere. And it now is faced with a potential peer competitor that it's going to have to deal with. And it still has to end the forever wars. These are not problems that Brazil has. Thankfully, from Brazil's point of view, Brazil's not a great power. And as I said to you, and I don't have to tell you because you know better than I do, Brazil lives in a relatively peaceful neighborhood. So the last thing that Brazil should do is start throwing its weight around militarily. It would not be in Brazil's interest to act like the United States. I do think Brazil should become more powerful if it can. That gets back to the previous question. But I don't think that Brazil has any interest in acting in international politics the way the United States does. The two countries' foreign policies are fundamentally different for good reasons. And that's to Brazil's advantage, in my opinion.
All right. I think we are coming to an end, Professor. I would like to thank you so much for the acceptance of this invitation. It has been a great evening learning directly from you. Most of our students read your text, and they are probably here very happy to see you in face, live, and so pass these lessons directly to us. We are very thankful. It was a pleasure to have you here. I will let you give your last words to us today, and then Professor Dulce can close the meeting. Thank you once more.
Thank you. I would just like to thank everybody again for turning out tonight and for asking excellent questions, for listening to what I had to say. And as I said at the beginning, I'll say again, I only regret that I'm not physically there in Brasilia and that we can't go out for a good dinner now and continue the conversation. But we'll just have to wait a few more years, unfortunately, for that to happen. But again, thank you to all.
Oh, Professor, we are really, really grateful. Thank you again for being with us and sharing your knowledge. We look forward to welcoming you here, and let's do dinner.
Thank you. Good night to everybody.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night to everybody.
Muito obrigada aos presentes. Obrigada, professor Fred.
Obrigado, professor. Thank you again.